Kappalainen. I'm Vice Dean of the Faculty of Arts. And next, we will have the honor of listening to the inaugural lecture by MULKI AL-SHARMANI, whose appointment as a professor in our faculty we are very pleased about. MULKI AL-SHARMANI is the professor of Islamic studies. Her research connects textual and ethnographic approaches and questions. She works on Islamic law, the Quran and feminist exegesis, Muslim women and their scholarly and activist engagements with religious texts. Her research covers both Muslim majority contexts with a focus on Egypt and diasporas with focus on Finland. And she was also awarded with Oscar Öflund's Foundation's Award for Researchers of Outstanding Merits in 2020. Please.
Thank you. And it's nice to see my tribe. They're here. Okay, so yes. So thank you all for your interest, and I hope you're not running out of energy, particularly those who've been here since the very beginning. I appreciate your interest. So I want to share with you one of the central questions that has been running in my research. And three things that I will talk about is Islamic ethics, law, specifically Islamic family law, and feminist hermeneutics. Now, ethical questions are very intrinsic to many branches in Islamic religious sciences, whether it's in the Quran to start with, or in what we call theology, which talks about divine and the nature of the divine and the human mandate on earth, or whether we're talking about Sufism, which is the branch of Islam that focuses on Sufism and or law. So ethical questions are really everywhere in different religious sciences. I'm not going to cover that. I'm interested in it as it pertains to law, right? And one would argue, based on scholarship, that Islamic law has a very important ethical dimension to it. One very clear example is that, for example, Islamic law has kind of like 5 categories or criteria by which to evaluate an act. It can be something obligatory that one has to do, or the other very end is something that is prohibited, that we're not supposed to do, but in the middle, it could be something that is recommended, something that is permissible, or something that is frowned upon. And the boundaries between these have to be evaluated. Now, when it comes to feminist hermeneutics, there are different kinds of feminist approaches. I'll share with you one approach that I've been studying, and I'm interested in it as a methodology in how we engage with text, how we interpret religious texts, Islamic texts in this case. But I'm also interested in feminism as a scholarship that brings together so-called lived Islam and textual Islam. So it's a particular kind of feminist scholarship that I'll share with you today. And from the question of my title, what I want to argue, the takeaway that I want you to get from this lecture is that feminist hermeneutics, the approach that I'll share with you and some of the reflections, focus on question of gender, the construction of gender identities, gender norms, and so on. But my argument is that actually its contributions, scholarly-wise, go beyond that. It also opens the door to other questions that are relevant, that are important to scholars, even those who are not working on gender. It can, and this particular kind that I'll share with you, raises questions about the relationship between theology, ethics, and law. What do? I work on Islamic text. My starting point at the beginning, and still now in a way, is on modern family laws, Muslim family laws, that are drawn from what we call fiqh, i.e. Islamic jurisprudence or traditional Islamic law. And I'm interested in how the two are related. There are many codified Muslim family laws now in Muslim majority context that draw from that traditional Islamic law, but in very interesting ways. And this leads me to also study the Quran, because the Quran is one main source of Islamic law. And particularly in the Quran, I'm interested in the relationship between ethics and law, and how the interplay between the two plays out in when we construct a legal norm, focusing on gender. That's one part of my research. The other part of my research is I am research two groups of Muslim women and what they do with these religious texts, whether it's the Quran, exegetical corpus, whether it's traditional Islamic law or modern Muslim family laws. And these two groups of women are, one group are scholars, they're Muslim scholars, they're academics, tenured professors based in UK, in US, in Indonesia, in Egypt, in Morocco. And why am I interested in them? Because they have been working on these hermeneutical approaches towards Islamic texts. And particularly their work, I think, is interesting because it speaks to this larger question that interests me between the ethical and the legal. Also, I'm interested in this group of women because they, in addition to being academics and being very, very well versed in traditional Islamic textual tradition, but also bringing to the text new theories, feminist theories, literary theories, they bring their knowledge to particular societal engagements. So, for example, they're working with religious scholars in Morocco. They are working with Islamic schools in Indonesia, and they're working with policymakers. Some of them are based in America and Canada, work with mosques. So they're kind of academics who produce peer-reviewed, and they are professors and teachers of students, but also very much involved in what we might call marrying knowledge with societal engagement, and several of them work together as well. I'm also interested in another group of women, just non-scholar women, Muslims again, not organized Muslims the way we use that term, i.e. they're not part of movements, they're not part of Islamic movements or anything, but they are interested in learning Islam or Islamic textual tradition from different sources. And I'm interested in, again, how they interpret these texts. And what I do with them is I do these life story interviews and I hang out with them. And I'm particularly interested in how they bring their life experiences to the text and vice versa. Why these two women? Because, and of course, my entry point and my focus is usually the gender question. Because on the one hand, there's the idea is, are these some of these scholarly ideas trickling down to these regular women? But that's only one part that interests me. What interests me is also in how can we understand the tradition in a very dynamic way through these two groups of women and what they do with text. So with the women who are non-scholars but from different walks of life, they work in different fields, some of them are students, but also usually their engagement with the text is through their life experiences. So I'm interested, so it gives me a window also to understand the tradition in a more dynamic way, the lived aspect of it as well as the textual. And as was mentioned earlier, I do texts, so I work with texts, but I'm also trained as an anthropologist, so I do a lot of ethnographic research. Okay. Now, just to explain a little bit these feminist hermeneutics, based on the scholars that I've studied, and I identify two broad approaches. Colleagues of mine who work on this in other traditions or in general in any text would be familiar with it. So the first is what I call hermeneutics of deconstruction, and I'm interested in how these scholars trace the formation of particular concepts that become then the foundation or the basis for the construction of legal norms. For example, let's say there's a norm called male authority, qiwama, right? How do these scholars trace in the textual tradition how these concepts are formed, what shifts happen over the centuries, and then somehow what role do they play now? Also, deconstructing the methodologies that early jurists and exegists used, right? And I'll give you some examples of both. But the reconstruction part is I look at, first of all, okay, how do they offer new readings of particular verses that have to do with gender? But I'm also interested in how their readings and their arguments speak and illuminate other, beyond that, beyond the gender question, new understandings about the divine, new understandings about the human mandate on earth, new understanding about how to, for example, what the Quran means, right? And this is the main question that I'll be focusing on today, right? So I'll give you an example so that you are with me, how this works, deconstruction, reconstruction, from one scholar and from one Muslim Finnish woman that I've spent time with, who is not a scholar, right? Okay. Sorry, did I go? Yes, yes. Okay, just to, for those of you who don't work on this, okay, why bother with the question of gender? Because in Islamic law, particularly since I work on Islamic family law, there are very clear gender, there is very clear gender hierarchy. There is a construction of unequal marriage, divorce, and parenting rights in classical Islamic jurisprudence, and they're still reflected in quite a few Muslim family laws now that are codified. There have been some changes, but there are. And perhaps you are familiar with some of it. For example, although entering into marriage is based on the consent of both parties, but divorce, the different kinds of divorce, one kind is unilateral. The man, the husband, can unilaterally end the marriage, right? Women have to go to court or have to negotiate with the husband, right? So divorce is not equal. Even with the marriage, some legal schools necessitate, although the consent of the woman is important legally, they necessitate that a guardian, a male guardian, needs to be involved in the conclusion of that marriage, usually her father or her grandfather, right? Also, how parenting is constructed in classical Islamic jurisprudence, and this is still reflected in quite a few Muslim family laws that are codified by the state now. It's very gendered. So legally, the father is the guardian, al-wali, responsible for the management of the financial issues of the children, with their movement, their health. The mother is custodian, so she is in charge of the physical care, the nurturing care, and this is sometimes can be an issue even when the two parties are together. For let's say the child has to have an operation, legally she needs the consent of the father, and definitely it becomes an issue if the two people break up, because she even if though she's custodian, the kids might be under her custody, she does not have guardianship over them, and she needs the consent of the father. Of course, laws in different countries have changed that, but that's how it's constructed, right? And another interesting, important issue is in the public sphere, which somehow comes from classical Islamic jurisprudence from the private sphere, and that is also these traditional legal schools have restricted women's access to political leadership and judicial leadership. The schools are different in that, but that's also quite unequal. Okay, so one example I'll give you is from the scholar Niveen Rida, who's based at the University of Toronto. And I'll give you an example of how does she do deconstructing methodologically, and also how does she do a reconstructing, focusing on the question of women's leadership. So traditional Islamic law, the sources of the law are the Quran, understood in classical traditional Islamic theology as the word of God, right? And the second one is the hadith, sayings attributed to Prophet Muhammad. And then there's the consensus of the jurists, ijma', and there's something called analogical reasoning I'm not getting to, right? The Quran being a source of law, these classical jurists assumed that certain verses are verses of legal competence. They are the ones that are the basis for rulings, right? Not all the verses, and also the way they decided which verses is also interesting, because the Quran consists of about 6,232 verses, and they agreed, although not exactly the same figure, but it's between 80 to 350 only verses that are legal verses or verses of legal competence, but not the others. For example, narratives in the Quran, traditionally by these classical jurists, are not considered that they have a legal competence, that we can use them when we construct or derive a ruling from the Quran. So she tries to deconstruct that methodology. Where did it come from? How was it formed? What debates did these early jurists have about that, right? And then she also goes into these classical jurists assumed if the Quran is silent on something, doesn't mention, particularly in those specific verses that are designated as legal verses, then the hadith comes in, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, as a source of law, to explain, or even becomes a source of law. So, and in some cases, the hadith was privileged of the Quran, particularly if the Quran was silent, right? And so she also deconstructs that. Why is that the case? Were there debates among them? And what is the problem also with how they constructed the consensus of the jurists? Because they debated among themselves, okay, on which consensus and how do we verify it as well, right? So she goes through that. I won't give you the details, but what she does, first of all, critiques this methodology, tries to trace how was it formed, what were the debates among them. Then she says, okay, can we revisit this? Can we revisit what these jurists came up with regarding the law, ruling on women's leadership? Because the Quran is silent, doesn't tell us women could be leaders or women could not be leaders. Specifically, these verses that these jurists designated as verses of legal competence. And moreover, we have a hadith that causes a dilemma. It's attributed to Prophet Muhammad. It's found in one of the authoritative compilations that are supposedly verified according to the traditional methodology of verifying hadith. And it says, as you can read, okay, never shall prosper folk who put their affairs in the hands of a woman. And quite a few jurists, in not all the schools, but this is a dominant legal opinion that based on this hadith, since the legal verses in the Quran is silent on that, women are not allowed to become, for example, caliph, or not allowed to be leaders. And some of them said even not allowed to be judges, right? So she says, okay, what do we do with that? And their assumption is, let's still work with that traditional methodology that says the Quran is the first source of the law, right? The hadith, ijma', and then she says, okay, can we reconstruct? Can we look at it differently? So what does she do? She spends a lot of time in many of her works studying. First of all, she poses this question, and she's not alone. Can we, as a hypothesis, can we say this Quran constructs a coherent ethical worldview? Is there such thing? And she's not alone who's interested in that question. Many people, scholars have studied that. And in order to answer that question first, so she adopts this surah-based, surah means chapter, surah-based structural, so reads all the chapters, looks how they build on each other. She has this hypothesis that they build on each other, what's going on thematically within each chapter, and so on. And having studied that, she argues that actually we could understand the Quran as consisting a coherent whole, right? Having a coherent moral message, and the key message, which is about this world as well as the afterworld, is that the mandate of the human, the one who accepts this message and wants to follow it, is to grow spiritually, to do the spiritual work of cultivating their self. And nafs, which is a term that is mentioned a lot in the Quran, and it could have different spiritual stations. So there is the self that incites evil, there's the self that reflects, it's blaming self, it knows it can stray, but it's all the time working on itself. And there are different stations until the self reaches, the self that is satisfied, reach the very high spiritual condition. And these are key concepts in the Quran. They are there in the Quran. And she says these are foundational things. The Quran is a method, is a spiritual method. We should read it as a whole. And if we read it as a whole and assume, that's hypothesis, this is the foundational message, and we go back to the idea of female leadership. Okay, these verses that the jurist said has not, these are legal verses. They don't talk about leadership. But what about narratives? So she goes to chapter 27 in the Quran, which the central theme, if you read the whole chapter, is really about power. And it provides several stories that are also familiar in the biblical sources. And the stories, they all talk about the use and abuse of power. And one of them that takes a lot of space in that chapter is the encounter between Queen Sheba and Prophet Solomon. And the text goes in detail about how she's judicious. She consults her people when Solomon sends her and he wants her to come to him to follow his religious path. And then they say, well, you are a leader, and she consults them. And so constructs her in the Quran in a very positive light, extremely positive light. And the question that she's a woman is not relevant if you read the text. So Rida argues, okay, this is relevant, this is important, this should function based on her premise that it's a coherent ethical message, that there's a foundational message first that should be the framework under which we understand how we derive particular norms. So she says this narrative should be a basis for driving a norm from the Quran on female leadership, right? And hence, and there are other scholars, by the way, adopting a very different approach, for example, the historical critical approach, who also made that argument and looked at the question of narratives and what role they play in norm making in the Quran. So this is one example. Very quickly, the other example. Okay. And this is from, I call her Nafisa, a woman that I had the privilege to meet and interview many times over several years, lives here in Finland, and works in a different field, not academic or anything. Now, according to traditional Islamic law, and this is also the case in many Muslim family laws now, although there's been restrictions, polygamy is allowed, is permissible, right? It's not, remember those 5 categories. It is not obligatory, but it's permissible, right? Okay, so I give you an example of Nafisa. This is what I call her. And we were talking about, and when I talk to these women, I'm also interested in kind of like tracing the trajectory and the changes across their life cycle in how they understand and relate to texts, right? Because I'm very much interested in the interplay between life experiences and these texts, right? So, and the way she kind of like this ethical reasoning that's going on here interests me, and the way I interpret it, right? So this is a quote from her, right? So she says, okay, it's in the Quran. There are other scholars, she's not a scholar, but there are scholars and regular people who would say, yeah, but you have to understand this text in a certain way, because also the verse says, if you are not just, then one. So there's a restriction, and the monogamy is the norm and all that, right? But her starting point is, okay, I accept it's in the Quran, and probably Quran, if I accept that it's a source of the law, the Quran allows it. But then she talks about another thing, another important, ethical mandate that she says she has, that according to the Quran also, that she's supposed to be a good Muslim. And use their certain values from the Quran that emphasize that, kind of like speaking back to what Rida was saying about the spiritual growth, right? So here, her point is that the Quran also wants you to be a good Muslim. And for her, she privileges that. That is more important. That takes priority over polygamy. So what she does is that when she concluded her Islamic marriage contract here, she used something that is allowed in Islamic law and put a stipulation that her husband cannot take a second wife. Right. Okay, so very quickly, what are the takeaways? In addition to understanding where do these hierarchical gender norms come from, can we reread them in a different way? And also looking at the limits of each approach, which I didn't get into, right? But I'm also interested in, okay, what do they bring to the table in terms of how we read the Quran. Because classical exegesis, the traditional tafsir is exegesis of the Quran, is atomistic. So these early exegetes, they would go verse by verse from the very beginning of the chapter. Now, some of these scholars, and also these women I talked to, adopt a very different approach, a holistic approach, but in different ways also, right? And also, I'm interested in how these approaches also shed light on, when we read the Quran, is there a connection between verses that talk about cosmology, nature, and afterworld, and what happens to you in the afterworld, and also gender, right? So that's one thing. Also, it raises the question of, why do we read the Quran? For what purpose, right? And how does that purpose necessitate a certain kind of reading? And the purpose of the law, because if it's a text-based law and it's supposed to be about the afterworld and about this world, and it's about helping you cultivate yourself, and there's this important ethical dimension to it, what does that mean? And that's also an interesting question too. Can that happen when it becomes a codified law, which is the case in quite a few Muslim majority contexts? Can you have that ethical reasoning, right? In which, as I hope I've shown to you, involves, kind of like an active engagement with the text. And, so part of that, doing that ethical reasoning, means also figuring out what are the different ethical teachings that this text is important to me, and how do I make sense of them. So it's not at all kind of like a passive engagement at all, right? Why these two women? Like I said, on the one hand, I think in different ways, it shows also kind of like this, how both of them sometimes also grapple with what is ethical, what is legal, how do they relate to one another, how do I make sense of it, right? And as I said earlier, for me, it shows me also that the tradition, or it allows me to study in what way this tradition is dynamic. It doesn't stay in text. What do people do with it, right? Okay, and then, yes, this is my book. Sorry for making a pitch for it. It has more of the research that I've been doing for quite a few years. If you're interested, we have it as a copy in the library. And what's next for me, which I'm very excited about, and it's comparative research. I'm interested in these same questions. How do they play out in other religious traditions, specifically Abrahamic religions, right? And what can I bring back to Islamic tradition by studying these other traditions comparatively? And I'm influenced here by a scholar called Jerusha Rhodes, who does this kind of work. And particularly influenced and have been learning a lot from having taught comparative theology in these three religions, feminist theology, that is, with co-taught with colleagues of mine who are experts in these other traditions. So this is, and I think we're not interested so much, and it's going to be collaborative research in like, okay, is the same thing happening in Judaism or Christianity, but we're much more interested in the methodological questions, and why do we compare and for what purposes? And also, what can I learn from the way certain concepts and stories are constructed, let's say, in rabbinic literature, and bring it, and how does it help me bring new questions to the Islamic tradition? Thank you.